I will say that given the nature of the conference being hosted in Houston in America underneath the current Biden administration, a lot of the speakers were from Biden administration. So you have the Secretary of Energy in Granholm, you have, the head of the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, you have John Kerry, who of course is part of Biden's house. And so those would be, to my mind, the most binary conversations that I have, where it was like, it's this or it's that. One thing that was really interesting was you also got to listen to two senators. One is Lisa Murkowski. She's Republican from Alaska. And then Senator Manchin, who's a Democrat from West Virginia, which is coal country. And both of them are well known for being sort of counter the typical Republican and Democrat lines. So they occupy this very empty space in the middle and get criticized on both sides, which I always thought was a great kind of thing. And I thought that they actually kind of gave a more balanced speech about what's realistic, that echoed a lot of what I was hearing from not so much the big companies, but more from startups. Like, I feel like startups, the further away you are from the center of power, the more perspective you have, almost, in some ways. Whereas the CEOs are very careful. There's the same line. Everybody across the board, by the way, all the big oil and gas companies from BP to Exxon, all the way across, all the, and same thing with nuclear, everything, they're all like, we get it. Emissions have to get down to net zero. Like, that has to happen. That's an imperative. It's not even a question anymore, where it might have been pre-COVID at the last conference. So that is unassailable. And so that's not even the question. It's like, if you're still talking about that, like, you're wasting our time. So that was one thing that I thought was really interesting. But then it was really just about the breadth of the solutions, that you can no longer just be good at one thing. I think that was the biggest difference, is you need to understand where the money's coming from, where policy is going, where your global supply chain is coming in, and the complexity of managing that is a problem. And I would suggest, I was talking to some university students at U of T and Bishops this week about getting into the oil and gas industry specifically. And so as a separate part of that question, they're like, well, would you recommend getting into oil and gas? And I was like, well, frankly, if you care about energy, it's the biggest thing. One thing I can say for certain is that the oil and gas energy as it sits right now are the best positioned to understand how to move all those parts globally around the world. They've been doing supply chains, they've been doing labor issues, they've dealt with different policies in different governments. They are experts in moving money and resources around the world. And while that resource might change, a lovely startup like Natalie, who I was talking to yesterday from, again, Carbon Upcycling, who's amazing, she simply does not have that breadth. So for her to be partnering with oil and gas companies for the expertise in these complex things, so we can do the transition together, will be imperative. Will it still be as many molecules, aka carbon chains like that, as it will be electrons? I hope not. I think everyone understands that. But you cannot just get rid of that huge talent of information without considering that. I think certainly, so there's an entire section of the conference, it's called the Agra, and that's where a lot of the startups are. And so it was really exciting to see what was going on. Now, there was specific hubs, as I mentioned earlier, on carbon management, which is all the carbon capture. There was on batteries and storage, which really kind of pulled in the electrification of the grid and how to, so again, I think the difference, Tatiana, is that there's no question we're gonna have wind and solar. It was like, how do we make it work? How do we get it to scale? How do we manage the supply chain, pieces like that. But I'll also say there was representation, went to a great session on carbon offsets and how the role forestry plays and how do we regulate that. So if you're a coal company and you want to work towards zero emissions, you know that today you can't do that. So what are coal companies doing? They're investing hardcore in forestry companies so that they can try to redo reforestation and forestry management and get the carbon offsets. Now there's complications with that place as well, but they're looking for, okay, if I can't fix this problem that is sort of a wicked inherent problem to coal, how can I still provide what I'm doing and what else can I do instead? So I do think that there was a big part of that. I will also say this, hydrogen is the energy that everyone is all excited about. And as a, the scientist in me, I have a chemistry degree and kind of that's always been a core piece for me. So never mind the nuclear side, which is also very exciting. But there's a big talk around hydrogen. It was the word of the space. It's not affordable. It's not commercialized right now. There's a lot of places to go there, but there's a strong belief that that is going into the future. And the fact that that was mentioned in nearly every conversation, Tatiana, just tells me that people recognize that there has to be a shift. They're just not choosing one path. They're just choosing every path to get there. I think there's a really cool one on what's called methane pyrolysis. So the word pyrolysis is like you've heard of pyromaniac, which means like firebug, right? So pyrolysis literally is the use of fire. And as you guys probably know, methane is a big problem wherever a gas, and especially natural gas, is being produced. And that's a really, it's very intensive in terms of its impact on the environment. And it's a place where actually Canada has been enormously leaders. You can see how we're doing that. Having said that, there is still going to be part of it. So one of the things is, what do you do with all that extra methane? So if you can get the methane out, if you regulate it that way, and then if you have the privilege of being able to build pipelines to transport that methane and do something with it, because if you capture it, where's it going to go? Methane pyrolysis is where you apply heat through this, and I didn't really understand the technology, to be quite honest, but you actually separate the hydrogen from the carbon. So methane is CH4, so 1 carbon and 4 hydrogen molecules hydrogen atoms in each molecule. And if you could take the 1 carbon out, you're left with all this hydrogen, which goes to Tatiana's questioning on hydrogen as the different forms of gas there. And then you're left with 1 carbon, but in this case, that carbon becomes what they call carbon black, which is just a carbon powder that, because it doesn't get burned, there's no emissions. And that's what you can use for carbon fiber and all the different things that we use, carbon and steel and everything else, so that we can use it as a building block that doesn't have the emissions associated. So I thought that was actually really cool, especially because it wasn't just an idea. This is one that's like at a commercial scale now. It's gone through the national, United States has this great national lab where they try to get things from the lab to commercialization, and it's like graduated. So that was cool. Look up methane pyrolysis with the Y. I'll say that my honest opinion over the top is that we were an afterthought. Like it was like, it's astonishing to me, given that we have the 3rd largest reserves, we're the 4th largest gas producer. We already have, like, our hydro is enormous. We do a great job with nuclear, like that we are participants in all of these forms. But we were an afterthought because right now we simply can't share. And so it was 2 things. This one was like, yeah, I don't get why you guys are hoarding. Like, it was kind of the way her conversation went. And I was quite surprised by it. I've always said, I mean, it's our logo, right? The world needs more Canadian resources, but I'd never heard it from somebody else. So that's one thing. I will say, conversely, did talk to some people who are like, yeah, we want to have all solutions on deck, but there might be different exceptions. So in Germany, talk to some people from Germany, they're like, listen, we're just not going to do nuclear. And we're not going to go back to crude. Like, those things are not happening. Oil sands it's a non-starter for us. We'll go back to coal. And there's a lot of, and you might be surprised, well, why would you go back to coal? But there's a whole history of coal development and independence and all the other communities, social issues that are a part of that. So different places do that. There was a conversation with some people in the United States where they're like, yeah, we get it. You're our allies. You think like us. We're right here. We want to bring a lot of your gas down, but we don't want any of your Alberta oil sands. You know, they didn't use the same word, but so it was sort of different depending on, frankly, how much energy you've got. The less energy security a country had, the more they really wish Canada would get all of our stuff to market. And countries that had options, exercise those options in different ways, is what I will say. Yeah. So, but primarily, I think the biggest piece was that we have become an afterthought in the conversation, which was tragic. And hopefully that will change. Furthermore, one last thing though, is that there was a big discussion. There was a whole thing about oil sands pathways, and oil sands pathways is how do we get our oil sands? It was really well appreciated that in Canada, a truly Canadian solution is to take the 5 large players in the oil sands, all fierce competitors, and they're getting together and they are sharing all their resources, sharing all their technology, sharing their successes, because they know that they move faster together as a whole group instead of individually. And so that was championed as a model, which I think Canadians can all be very proud of. Secondly, there was a question that was asked by the host of the entire thing, Daniel Jurgen. He's like, so we have an energy problem. It was on the day that they announced they were no longer going to accept Russian oil, and they have a deficit of 800,000 barrels. Where are we going to get it from? And the answer from the Pathways representative was like, we could provide you with about 1/3 of that right away, not via pipeline, via rail, but we're here. We're ready to offset. Can we get it to Europe? No, but we can send it to the United States to offset the pulling in that the United States has from other places. So there were some big picture pieces going on. I think it's just regrettable in all cases. We had, Manchin, we had Murkowski, we had a lot of people say, why are we not looking to the north, to our allies? And so hopefully they will.
Yeah, that's so true. And it's interesting to hear that, because obviously us being in Canada, we never really hear that side of things, of how others see us. And I mean, for me, I was in like international development as a stream for a little bit, and a really common thread was, oh, like it's so difficult to get world leaders to come together, or it's a lost cause, or that kind of stuff. So based on what you saw at that conference, what would you say to that, or to those people who are kind of concerned about the potential or ability for us as a world to actually come together with those solutions?
Well, I will say this, that if there is a silver lining to this devastating, just tragic stuff that's happening in Ukraine, it's that the world has stood up and said, we won't tolerate it. And that I think that one of the discussions on geopolitics was that we stood up and said that we're going to work together. So that would be one piece. The second part to your question, Tatiana, is, working together. I would say that it's a problem that doesn't have a solution, but they're talking about it. And I'll say this in the context, for example, of Africa. There's a whole discussion of Africa on its own, because that's where most of the billion people who don't have access to reliable energy are. And so a lot of debate on how do we work to get the funding to them when there's no systems there? What kind of energy makes sense? Where do we have places where we can leapfrog them to having no grid? So there's no barriers to having an old grid that you have to upgrade, and right into electrification with solar or wind. But then what about places where it's like, well, we just got to stop them from burning wood inside the tent version of a home that they have that is causing people to breathe this in. Like diesel would be a better choice. Propane would be a better choice. If you're going to just ask yourself, would you rather stand over a little propane grill or over a fire inside your tent to cook food? That's the choice. So I think that there was a lot of collaboration, and it was really interesting. There was this huge Nigerian group of people. Nigeria, of course, has a huge amount of oil and gas. And so I sat at a table with a couple of them for one time, and they just said their problems in many ways seem very different from the problems that we're facing in Canada, where they're worlds apart. Interesting though.
That's fascinating for sure. So we talk a lot at SFC. We work with the Indigenous Resource Network and Indian Resource Council and other organizations that get Indigenous people involved in energy. Did you see Indigenous involvement, not necessarily North American Indigenous folks, but did you see those voices being integrated into discussions at CERAWeek?
To be honest, it was one of the things that we noted at the Canadian House is how we were unique. And so it was brought up at the two sessions where Canada was talking about that part of social and governance. And I think that that's a tribute to us as leaders, that we have made that a priority, and that we generally are held up as a model for how you can have those genuine, not just partnerships, but like ownership through Indigenous. And as you guys know, I could go on at length at that, but I would say that was not something that came up in any of the sessions that I saw. It was more just broadly from my country, here's what our needs are. We need this energy. Here's what we've got access to. Here's our geopolitical problems, and less the domestic problems with Indigenous communities within the country. From my perspective, I would say modeling what I saw at this conference, and I think that that's one of the mandates of SFC, is that you would have people on a panel and they were just having conversations. The entire thing, there's no PowerPoint, by the way, there were no slides. Everything was a moderator and one or two or three or four people having a conversation. And very often they didn't agree. But they would have a conversation, and one person would be like you would make a comment, Lyndon, and then Tatiana would be like, well, I agree with when you said this and this, but where I disagree is this. That was the language that was used. And so you had people from different perspectives, whether they be financiers, public sector, private sector, but they were having an actual constructive dialogue. And I think that we've forgotten how to do that. And so if there was something that I think SFC could do, would be seek out people with differing opinions from yourself and allow yourself to be challenged by what they say. Allow yourself to focus first on what you can have in common and what you're both working, like how you can both contribute to the same solution. And I guess going back to Daniel Jurgen's word, that again, the guy who did this, it was about, focusing on the solution that is solving all these bits, And so if you're, and then back to the first thing I said, how you define the problem, those were the words they said. So if you can sit down with people that think differently and define the problem in a way that you're all working on the same thing, change the words so you can do that, I think that would be the best thing.
That's fascinating for sure. And for those who are listening, SFC has hosted guests in the past who specifically focus on how to find common ground and be accommodating of others, and how to have conversations with people that are difficult to engage with. But to come together to find a common solution and to realize that ultimately we all kind of want the same things. This about wraps up our time for today. Lynn, thank you so much for sharing your experience with us at CERAWeek. I can't imagine how exciting that event must have been.
Yeah, I just wish they had like an opportunity where you could send student ambassadors, because I'd be pushing hard for you guys, but so far not yet.